In the sleepy English village of Willowbrook, one frosty November evening, the precise widow Mrs. Hargrove draws her curtains an hour early, a break in routine that gentle spinster Jane Marple cannot ignore. Behind those velvet folds, a foreign stranger, a missing war medal, forged letters in emerald ink, and a desperate extortion that spirals into poison, faked suicide, and midnight arrest. From a single drawn curtain to a churchyard restoration of honor, this is the quiet, deadly game where Miss Marple's knitting needles unravel murder, and every closed window hides a secret waiting to kill. Chapter 1. The Unwelcome Return. The omnibus wheezed to a halt beside the stone war memorial in the center of Willowbrook, exhaling a plume of diesel that hung like a ghost in the November air. Miss Jane Marple descended with the careful dignity of a woman who has learned that haste is the enemy of observation. She wore a neat gray coat, a felt hat pinned at a precise angle, and carried a string bag containing a modest parcel from the Army and Navy stores. The driver touched his cap. The conductor, a boy new to the route, stared at her as though she were a relic from another age. She smiled serenely and set off along the lane that curved between clipped hedges towards her cottage. Willowbrook lay under a thin, glittering frost. The roofs of the older houses wore white caps. The newer bungalows, built for retired colonels and their widows, looked merely shabby in the cold light. Smoke rose in straight blue columns from chimneys, and somewhere a dog barked with the mechanical persistence of a clockwork toy. Miss Marple noted all this with the part of her mind that never quite relaxed, even when the rest of her was occupied with the small, practical business of returning home. Dame Mead Cottage stood at the end of a short gravel path, its windows bright with late chrysanthemums in tubs. The key turned smoothly in the lock. She had oiled it before her departure, and the familiar scent of lavender polish and coal smoke greeted her like an old friend. She set down her bag, removed her gloves finger by finger, and surveyed the sitting room. Everything was precisely as she had left it. The gate-legged table by the window, the chintz-covered armchair angled to catch the light, the small bookcase with its rows of green and gold Tauchnitz editions. Only the clock on the mantel had stopped at 3:20 on the day she left. She wound it now, listening to the comfortable tick resume its dominion over the quiet. Outside, the short afternoon was already fading. Miss Marple drew the curtain's thick brocade, lined with blackout material, a relic of the war, and lit the gas under the kettle. While it heated, she unpacked a skein of pale blue wool, a tin of Earl Grey, a detective novel by a writer whose ingenuity she respected, but whose psychology she found wanting. She placed the book on the table, spine outwards, and glanced across the narrow lane to the house opposite. Laburnum Cottage belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove, a widow of 58 with a passion for bridge and a reputation for plain speaking. The two women were not intimate. Mrs. Hargrove considered Miss Marple a little old-fashioned, while Miss Marple considered Mrs. Hargrove a little loud, but they exchanged courteous nods when their paths crossed at the post office or the Women's Institute. Mrs. Hargrove's curtains, Miss Marple knew, were closed every evening at dusk sharp, a habit as reliable as the church clock. Tonight, however, they had been drawn an hour early. The windows of Laburnum Cottage stared across the lane like blind eyes. The heavy green velvet pulled tight so that not a chink of light escaped. Miss Marple stood quite still, teapot in hand. The kettle began to sing behind her, but she did not move. Early curtains could mean illness, or a headache, or the desire for an early night. They could also mean something else entirely. She set the teapot down and crossed to the window, parting the brocade a fraction with 2 fingers. Nothing stirred. The frost on the path glittered faintly under the street lamp. The gate remained shut. Yet the silence felt weighted, as though the house opposite held its breath. Miss Marple let the curtain fall back into place. "Curious," she said aloud, her voice soft in the empty room. She poured her tea, added a slice of lemon, but no sugar, and carried the cup to her chair. The detective novel lay unopened on the table. Instead, she took up her knitting, the needles moving with the unhurried precision of long practice. Outside, the village settled into its winter evening. A door slammed, a bicycle bell tinkled, the distant whistle of the London train. Inside Dame Mead cottage, the fire settled in the grate with a small, contented sigh. Miss Marple knitted 3 rows, her thoughts turning over the small anomaly like a pebble in a stream. Mrs. Hargrove was not a woman given to nerves. She had nursed her husband through a long illness without once taking to her bed. Early curtains suggested either a visitor she did not wish to be seen, or a mood so black that even the fading daylight was unwelcome. Neither explanation quite satisfied. At 7:30, the telephone rang 3 short bursts, the Willowbrook Exchange's idea of efficiency. Miss Marple laid down her knitting and crossed the hall. The instrument was an old-fashioned one, mounted on the wall with a separate earpiece. "Yes?" she said. "Miss Marple?" "It's Gladys from Laburnum Cottage." The maid's voice trembled with excitement or fear. It was hard to tell which. "Madam's took badly, miss. Won't see no one. Says to tell the doctor she's got one of her heads. But the curtains, well, they've been shut since tea time, and she hasn't rung for her tray." Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. "Has she had a visitor, Gladys?" A pause. I couldn't say, miss. There was a gentleman yesterday, but he left before lunch. Tall, foreign-looking. Madam was ever so put out afterwards. Thank you, Gladys. I shall speak to Dr. Haydock in the morning. Try not to worry." She replaced the receiver and stood for a moment in the dim hall, one hand resting on the polished banister. A gentleman, foreign-looking, had left Mrs. Hargrove put out. The curtains had closed early. Somewhere in the quiet machinery of Willowbrook, a small cog had slipped. Miss Marple returned to the sitting-room, drew the curtains once more, and resumed her knitting. The pattern was a complicated 1 cables and blackberry stitch, but her fingers moved without hesitation. In her mind, another pattern was forming, delicate as lace, strong as steel. She would watch and wait and listen. In Willowbrook, as in human nature, the smallest deviation from habit was often the first thread in a tapestry of deceit. The clock struck 8. Outside, the frost deepened, and the drawn curtains of Laburnum Cottage remained implacably shut. Chapter 2. The Doctor's Discretion. The Morning Post arrived at Dame Mead Cottage with its usual punctuality. 1 seed catalogue, a bill from the draper, and a picture postcard of the Albert Memorial from Miss Marple's nephew Raymond. She placed the postcard on the mantelpiece beside the clock, paid the boy with a 6pence and a smile, and returned to the breakfast table where a single kipper waited under a domed silver cover. The fish was cooked to perfection. Mrs. Murgatroyd, who did, for her 3 mornings a week, had a light hand with the smoker, and Miss Marple ate it slowly, her gaze resting now and then on the house opposite. Laburnum Cottage looked almost aggressively normal in the pale sunlight. The curtains were open now, revealing the sitting-room window boxes, where geraniums had been replaced by forced hyacinths. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, well-behaved column. Yet the memory of those premature green folds lingered like a discordant note in an otherwise harmonious melody. At 9:30, Dr. Haydock's Morris Minor drew up outside. The doctor was a large man with a red face and a voice that carried to the back row of the village hall without effort. He had attended Miss Marple through a mild attack of influenza the previous winter and considered himself, in consequence, entitled to a certain familiarity. She heard his heavy tread on the gravel and opened the door before he could ring. "Good morning, doctor. You are very prompt." "Prompt?" He removed his hat and ran a hand over thinning hair. "I've been chasing my own tail since 7. Old Mrs. Price's lumbago, young Tommy Bantry's tonsils, and now Mrs. Hargrove barricaded in her bedroom. May I come in? I'm perishing." Miss Marple led the way to the sitting-room. The fire was newly laid. She touched a match to the kindling and watched the flames catch before turning to the tray she had prepared. A brown Betty teapot, 2 cups of eggshell porcelain, a plate of Marie biscuits. Dr. Haydock lowered himself into the larger armchair with the gratitude of a man whose knees protest every staircase. "You'll take milk, no sugar," she said, pouring. "And you will tell me about Mrs. Hargrove." He accepted the cup with both hands. "Nothing to tell, really. Gladys rang me at dawn, said her mistress had locked the door and wouldn't answer. I went round. Found Eleanor sitting up in bed, white as a sheet, insisting she had one of her heads. Pulse racing, pupils a trifle dilated. I gave her a sedative and told Gladys to keep the room quiet. She'll be right as rain by luncheon. Miss Marple handed him a biscuit. "And the curtains?" "Eh?" He bit the biscuit in half. "Oh, still drawn when I arrived." Gladys opened them. Said they'd been shut since yesterday afternoon. Eleanor claims she couldn't bear the light. He brushed crumbs from his waistcoat. "Migraine, I dare say." "She's had them before." Miss Marple sipped her tea. The doctor's diagnosis was plausible. Mrs. Hargrove's migraines were a village institution, as reliable as the church fete and twice as inconvenient. Yet the timing troubled her. Migraine did not explain a visitor who left in a hurry, nor the burning of papers in the grate. "Gladys mentioned a gentleman," she said mildly. Dr. Haydock snorted. "Foreign Johnny, Hungarian or some such. Came Tuesday, stayed an hour, drove off in a black saloon. Eleanor says he was a cousin by marriage, something to do with her late husband's regiment. Wanted a loan, apparently. She sent him off with a flea in his ear. He drained his cup and held it out for more. Between ourselves, Jane, the woman's a fool about money. Keeps a couple of $1,000 in the house, or so the bank manager let slip. Not that I'm one to gossip." "Of course not," Miss Marple murmured. "And the cousin's name?" "Varga. Carol Varga. Sounds like a music hall turn." The doctor glanced at the clock. "Must be off. Old Price will be timing me with her egg timer. If Eleanor isn't improved by evening, send Gladys round." He lumbered to his feet, retrieved his hat, and paused at the door. "You'll keep an eye, won't you? These widows lonely, you know. Easy prey for any smooth-talking rascal with a hard-luck story." Miss Marple assured him that she would. She watched the Morris disappear round the bend towards the High Street, then returned to the sitting-room and stood for a long moment at the window. The hyacinths in Mrs. Hargrove's window boxes were a violent pink. They clashed with the green curtains, which had been drawn back but not fully opened, leaving a strip of shadow across the glass. She made a mental note of the angle. Upstairs she changed into her gardening coat and a pair of stout shoes. The rose bed beneath the sitting-room window needed attention. The frost had blackened the last blooms, and the soil required turning. She worked steadily, her small secateurs snipping with precision. From this position, she had an oblique view of Laburnum Cottage's side gate. At 10:20 it opened, and Gladys emerged carrying a wicker basket. The girl hesitated, then crossed the lane with the air of one who has been sent on an errand she does not understand. "Morning, miss." Gladys bobbed a curtsy that belonged to another decade. "Madam says, could you spare a drop of your lavender water? Hers is all gone, and the chemists don't deliver till Friday." Miss Marple straightened, brushing earth from her gloves. "Of course, Gladys. Come inside." The kitchen smelled of toast and beeswax. Miss Marple fetched a small blue bottle from the dresser and poured a measure into a medicine glass. Gladys watched with round eyes. "Is Mrs. Hargrove any better?" The girl twisted her apron. "She's asleep, miss. Doctor's pills knocked her proper. But she was ever so queer last night, kept saying someone was watching the house. I looked out, but there wasn't a soul." Miss Marple corked the bottle. "And the gentleman who called on Tuesday?" Gladys flushed. "I only saw him from the landing. Tall, with a little mustache. Spoke funny. Madam was in the drawing-room with him near an hour. When he left, she went straight upstairs, and locked the door. I heard her crying, Miss, something awful. Crying? Miss Marple's tone invited confidence without demanding it, like her heart was broke. Then this morning she gives me £5, and says I'm to have the day off tomorrow, and not breathe a word to a soul. Gladys's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. There's something in the grate, miss. Burnt papers. I saw the corner of an envelope, green ink, foreign stamp. Smelled funny, too, like violets. Miss Marple handed over the lavender water. You are a good girl, Gladys. If Mrs. Hargrove should need anything at all, you will let me know at once. Gladys promised and departed, basket swinging. Miss Marple returned to her roses, but her mind was busy. Green ink, a foreign stamp, the scent of violets. She had encountered violet-scented notepaper once before, in the possession of a woman who had poisoned her husband with weed killer, and then taken the night train to Southampton. The woman had been acquitted. The jury had not understood the significance of the scent. Miss Marple understood. At 11 o'clock, the butcher's van drew up outside Laburnum Cottage. The boy carried in a parcel wrapped in white paper. Gladys signed for it and closed the door. 10 minutes later, the curtains in the upstairs bedroom were drawn fully across. Miss Marple noted the exact time on the grandfather clock in the hall, 11:12. She spent the remainder of the morning in small domestic tasks, darning a stocking, writing to Raymond about his postcard, arranging the chrysanthemums in a copper jug. At 12:30, she lunched frugally on bread and cheese and a glass of milk. The village lay somnolent under the weak sun. Only the occasional cyclist or pedestrian disturbed the quiet. Across the lane, Laburnum Cottage might have been deserted. Yet at 2 o'clock, precisely, the side gate opened again. This time it was Mrs. Hargrove herself who emerged. She wore a dark coat with a fur collar and a hat pulled low over her eyes. Her step was hurried, almost furtive. She glanced neither right nor left, but set off down the lane towards the railway station, a small leather attach case in her gloved hand. Miss Marple watched until the figure disappeared round the bend by the lych gate. Then she removed her apron, put on her outdoor things, and followed at a discreet distance. The station was a quarter of a mile away, past the almshouses and the blacksmith's yard. Mrs. Hargrove did not pause at the booking office, but went straight to the down platform, where the London train was already signaled. Miss Marple purchased a platform ticket and took up a position behind a stack of milk churns. From here she could see without being seen. Mrs. Hargrove stood alone, the attach case clutched to her chest. Her face was pale, the mouth set in a line Miss Marple had never seen before. Twice she looked at her wristwatch. Once she glanced over her shoulder, as though expecting pursuit. The train drew in with a hiss of steam. Mrs. Hargrove boarded the rear coach and pulled down the blind. Miss Marple waited until the train was out of sight, then walked slowly home. The attach case had been new dark blue leather with brass fittings. Mrs. Hargrove's luggage was uniformly brown. Moreover, the case had bulged in an odd way, as though it contained something rigid rather than folded clothing. Back at Mead Cottage, she telephoned the station master, an old acquaintance who owed her a favor after she had identified the thief of his prize leeks. Yes, he said, Mrs. Hargrove had taken a single to town. No, she had not purchased a return. The train was the 2.17, due at Paddington at 3.45. Miss Marple thanked him and hung up. She stood for a moment in the hall, one hand on the newel post. Mrs. Hargrove had gone to London with a blue attach case and no return ticket. The curtains of Laburnum Cottage remained drawn upstairs and down. Gladys, presumably, had been given the rest of the day off. Miss Marple returned to the sitting room and took up her knitting. The pattern was a complicated one fisherman's rib with a cable twist, but her fingers moved without hesitation. In her mind another pattern was forming, delicate as lace, strong as steel. She would watch and wait and listen. In Willowbrook, As in human nature, the smallest deviation from habit was often the first thread in a tapestry of deceit. The afternoon wore on. At 4 o'clock, the light began to fail. Miss Marple lit the lamps and drew her own curtains. Across the lane, Laburnum Cottage remained dark and silent. Somewhere in London, Mrs. Hargrove was pursuing an errand that required secrecy and a blue attach case. Somewhere, perhaps, Carol Varga waited. Miss Marple knitted steadily until the clock struck 6. Then she laid down her work, put on her coat, and walked the short distance to the police station. Sergeant Pock was on duty, a stolid man with a mustache like a yard brush. "Good evening, Miss Marple. What can I do for you?" She smiled serenely. "I wonder, Sergeant, if you would be so kind as to telephone Scotland Yard and ask them to keep an eye on the 2.17 from Willowbrook. A Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove will be on it, traveling alone. She may be in some distress." Sergeant Pock opened his mouth, closed it again, and reached for the telephone. Miss Marple waited patiently, her gloved hands folded in her lap. Outside, the frost was beginning to glitter again on the pavements. The village settled into its winter evening, unaware that one of its most respectable widows had set in motion a chain of events that might yet end in violence. When the call was made, Miss Marple thanked the sergeant and walked home through the darkening lanes. The curtains of Laburnum Cottage were still drawn, but now a single light burned in the upstairs window, a small, steady glow like the eye of a watchful animal. Miss Marple let herself into Mead Cottage, hung up her coat, and returned to her knitting. The fire had burned low. She added a scoop of coal and watched the flames leap up. Somewhere in the quiet machinery of Willowbrook, a small cog had slipped. She intended to discover why. Chapter 3. The Letter in the Fire. The following morning broke with a hard white frost that turned the village roofs to silver. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and performed her small rituals with the precision of a priestess. The kettle filled, the fire raked, the curtains drawn back to admit the pale light. She breakfasted on porridge and a boiled egg, the shell tapped open with the back of a spoon, and read the Telegraph from front to back, noting with mild disapproval that the crossword had grown easier since the war. At 8:30, she donned her gardening coat again and stepped into the lane. The air stung her cheeks. Her breath hung in small clouds. Laburnum Cottage looked as though it had been carved from ice. The upstairs curtains were still closed, but the lower ones had been opened a cautious 6 inches. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney, thin and reluctant. Gladys answered Miss Marple's ring almost at once. The girl's eyes were red-rimmed. Her apron was twisted, as though she had been wringing it. "Oh, miss, I'm that glad to see you." Madam came back on the last train near 11 it was, white as a ghost and shaking like a leaf. Said she'd missed her connection and walked from Milchester. Walked? In them shoes? I got her to bed with a hot bottle, but she wouldn't take nothing to eat. Miss Marple stepped inside. The hall smelled of coal smoke and the faint, acrid tang of burnt paper. "Has Dr. Haydock been?" "Not yet. I telephoned, but the exchange said the line was engaged." Madam locked her door again and told me to leave her be. Gladys lowered her voice. "There's something in the fireplace, miss. I daren't touch it till she says." Miss Marple removed her gloves. "Show me." They went into the drawing-room. The fire had been laid but not lit. The ashes in the grate were gray and cold. Among them lay a scrap of thick cream notepaper, the corner scorched brown. Miss Marple knelt, heedless of her skirt, and with the tongs lifted the fragment clear. The ink was a vivid emerald green, the handwriting sloping and foreign. Only 3 words remained legible. Must have the... She laid the scrap on the mantelpiece and straightened. "When did this happen?" "Last night, after she came in. I was in the kitchen, but I heard the rustle of paper, and then the match. She must have burnt a whole packet, miss. The smell was something chronic. Miss Marple's gaze traveled the room. The furniture was solid Victorian mahogany. The antimacassars were starched to attention. On the sideboard stood a photograph of the late Captain Hargrove in dress uniform, his medals gleaming. Above the mantel hung an empty brass frame where a decoration had once been displayed. The glass was clean, the hook undisturbed. Gladys followed her glance. The medal's gone, miss. Madam said years ago she sold it to a collector in town, but I never believed her. Captain set great store by that bit of tin. Miss Marple made no reply. She crossed to the window and looked out at the lane. A black saloon car was parked beneath the chestnut tree, its bonnet still warm. The number plate was obscured by mud, but the shape was unmistakable. A Humber, expensive London registered. "Has the gentleman returned?" she asked. Gladys wrung her apron again. "I didn't see him come, but the car wasn't there yesterday. I found this under the door this morning." She produced a folded sheet from her pocket. The paper was the same thick cream, the ink the same virulent green. The message was brief. "Tonight, 11. Bring everything. V." Miss Marple read it twice, her face expressionless. "You have been very wise not to disturb your mistress with this, Gladys. May I borrow it? I will return it before evening." Gladys hesitated, then nodded. Miss Marple slipped the note into her handbag and took her leave, promising to send Dr. Haydock as soon as the exchange allowed. Back at Dane Mead Cottage, she telephoned the doctor's surgery. The maid reported him out on a confinement at the far end of the parish. Miss Marple left a message of studied vagueness and turned her attention to the scrap of envelope. She held it to the light. The watermark was a crown above the initials H & Co. Expensive Stationery, obtainable only from a certain shop in Bond Street. The postmark was blurred, but the country of origin was clear: Austria. She spent the morning in quiet industry. She wrote 3 letters, baked a seed cake, and polished the brasses until they shone like gilt. At noon she walked to the post office and purchased a reel of green cotton that matched the ink exactly. The postmistress, Mrs. Blade, was agog with curiosity. "Mrs. Hargrove's maid says she's took badly again. Foreign gentlemen hanging about. You don't think it's anything havey-cavey, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple smiled serenely. "My dear Mrs. Blade, widows are entitled to their little mysteries." She returned home to find Inspector Craddock on her doorstep. He was a tall young man with a lean face, and the weary patience of one who has learned that village constables are not always wrong. He removed his hat as she opened the door. "Miss Marple? Sergeant Pauk said you were concerned about Mrs. Hargrove. I've just come from Laburnum Cottage. She refuses to see me. Claims she's unwell and has no complaint to make." Miss Marple ushered him inside. "Tea, Inspector, or something stronger? You look frozen." "Tea, thank you." He glanced round the room with the quick appraisal of a man who misses nothing. The maid let slip about a visitor. "Carol Varga. He's known to us, small-time confidence man. Specializes in war widows with nest eggs. We lost him in Vienna last year. Thought he'd gone to ground." Miss Marple poured tea. "And the medal?" Craddock's eyebrows rose. "You don't miss much." "Yes, the military cross is missing. Mrs. Hargrove insists she sold it. The frame's empty, but the dust pattern suggests it was removed recently." They drank in silence for a moment. Outside, the frost began to thaw. Water dripped from the eaves with the regularity of a metronome. "I took the liberty," Miss Marple said, "of examining the ashes. There was a note green ink, 4 in hand. It said, 'Tonight, 11. Bring everything.'" Craddock set down his cup. "You remove evidence?" "I borrowed it." Gladys was distraught. "I thought it best to keep it safe until you arrived." She produced the folded sheet and laid it on the table. Craddock read it, his face grim. "This is extortion, or worse. I'll have a man watch the house." Miss Marple shook her head. "Mrs. Hargrove will not thank you. She is proud." Let me speak to her first. The inspector hesitated, then nodded. Very well. But if anything happens, anything at all, ring the station at once. After he left, Miss Marple returned to the window. The black Humber had gone. In its place stood a small van from the Milchester Gas Company. 2 men in overalls were unloading pipe. She watched until they disappeared round the back of the Burnham cottage, then took up her knitting. The afternoon passed in a hush of dripping eaves and distant church bells. At 4 o'clock Gladys appeared again, this time with a note in Mrs. Hargrove's handwriting, spidery, agitated. Dear Miss Marple, I am much recovered and beg you will not trouble yourself further. The matter is closed. Miss Marple read it, folded it small, and placed it in her purse beside the green ink message. She lit the lamps early. The short day was already dying. At 5:30, she put on her coat and walked across the lane. Gladys opened the door a crack. She's in the drawing room, miss. Says she'll see no one, but I dared to mention your name. Mrs. Hargrove sat by the fire, a rug over her knees, though the room was warm. Her face was haggard, the eyes sunken. The empty frame above the mantel caught the firelight and threw it back like a challenge. Miss Marple. Her voice was a thread. I told Gladys. You told her many things, Eleanor. Some of them true. Miss Marple took the chair opposite. The medal is gone. The money is gone. And tonight Mr. Varga returns. Mrs. Hargrove's hands clenched on the rug. You know nothing. I know that Captain Hargrove's military cross was awarded for gallantry at Paschendel. I know that you kept it, because it was all you had left of him. And I know that Carol Varga has convinced you it belongs to his family, stolen, perhaps, or lost in the chaos of war. A sob escaped the widow. He has papers, photographs, my husband's own handwriting on the back, to my dear comrade Janos, with gratitude. Janos was his brother. Carol is Janos's son. The medal is rightfully his. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. And the £2,000? Compensation. For the years they suffered. Mrs. Hargrove's chin lifted. I am not a fool, whatever the village thinks. I checked the dates, the regiment. Everything fits. Everything except the postmark on the envelope you burned. Vienna, 1947. Your husband died in 1980. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Mrs. Hargrove stared at the flames as though seeing ghosts. He will come at 11, she whispered at last. With a gun, he showed me. If I do not give him the rest, the bonds, the jewelry, he will shoot me and take it anyway. Miss Marple rose. Then we must be ready for him. She spent the next hour in quiet preparation. She telephoned Inspector Craddock with instructions as precise as a surgeon's. She persuaded Gladys to spend the night with her married sister in Milchester. She drew the curtains of the Burnham cottage herself, leaving one upstairs window unlatched. At 10 o'clock, she took up her position in the darkened dining room, a shawl about her shoulders, her knitting in her lap. The church clock struck 11. A soft crunch of gravel, the creak of the side gate. A figure in a dark overcoat slipped round the house and tapped at the kitchen door. Mrs. Hargrove's voice, steady now, called, Come in. Miss Marple waited. Footsteps crossed the hall. The drawing-room door opened and closed. She heard the low murmur of voices Mrs. Hargrove's, then a man's accented impatient. A chair scraped. Then silence. She rose, silent as a cat, and moved to the door. Through the crack she saw Varga standing by the fire, a pistol in his hand. Mrs. Hargrove was opening the safe behind the portrait of Captain Hargrove. The medals case lay on the table, the military cross gleaming inside. Varga's voice was soft, almost caressing. Quickly, madame. The bonds, the pearls. Then we are finished. Mrs. Hargrove turned, a bundle of papers in her hand. Her eyes met Miss Marple's through the gap. For a moment, time hung suspended. Then the front door burst open. Inspector Craddock and 2 constables filled the hall. Varga spun, pistol raised, but Craddock was faster. The gun clattered to the floor. Varga followed it, cursing in Hungarian. Mrs. Hargrove sank into a chair, the bonds fluttering from her fingers like white moths. Miss Marple stepped into the light. "It is finished, Eleanor," she said quietly. "The past is buried with the captain. Let the living bury their own." Later, when the police had gone and the house was quiet, Miss Marple stood once more at her own window. The frost had returned. The lane glittered like a river of diamonds. Laburnum Cottage was dark, but the curtains were open wide, letting in the cold, clean light of the moon. She closed her own curtains, drew the bolt, and went to bed. Tomorrow there would be talk, and questions, and the slow grinding of justice. Tonight there was only the tick of the clock, and the knowledge that a small wrong had been righted before it grew into a great one. In Willowbrook, as in human nature, the smallest spark could start a fire. Miss Marple had seen it quenched in time. Chapter 4. The Major's Medal. The arrest of Carol Varga traveled through Willowbrook with the speed and thoroughness of a November fog. By breakfast, the postmistress had the bones of the story. By 11s the butcher was adding flesh. By luncheon, the entire village knew that Mrs. Hargrove had been robbed of her savings and her late husband's military cross, and that Miss Marple Quiet, knitting Miss Marple, had been instrumental in the capture of a dangerous continental criminal. The only detail missing was the precise manner in which the elderly spinster outwitted a man with a pistol, and this omission provided fertile ground for speculation. Miss Marple herself rose above the gossip as serenely as a swan above pond weed. She attended matins, complimented Mrs. Blade on the new arrangement of tinned soups, and accepted with a murmured thank you a jar of blackberry jelly from the vicar's wife. Only when Major Palgrave waylaid her outside the lich gate did she permit herself a small, private smile. "By Jove, Miss Marple!" The Major's mustache bristled with excitement. "Heard you collared the blighter single-handed. Ought to put you in for a medal yourself. None of this modern rot straight in with both feet, what?" Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. "You are too kind, Major. I merely observed that the curtains were drawn early." "Curtains, eh?" He tapped his malacca cane against his leg. "Always said you had a nose for trouble. Mind you, I saw the fellow myself Tuesday. It was Black Saloon, London plates. Parked slap outside Laburnum Cottage. Watched him go in, bold as brass. Heard voices raised, you know. Then slam door shuts, engine roars, off he goes. Thought at the time it was deuced odd." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the war memorial. "You mentioned the medal, I believe? Eh? Oh, yes." Caught the words through the window open a crack, frost, and all that. The medal or the money, something of the sort. Thought it was a bet, bridge debts, you know how widows run on. Didn't connect it with the MC till Craddock told me. He lowered his voice. "Poor Eleanor. Always was a fool about that husband of hers. Kept the blessed thing in a glass case, like the crown jewels." Miss Marple murmured agreement and took her leave. The Major's testimony, delivered with the authority of a man who had once commanded a company at Ypres, would carry weight at the inquest. She walked home slowly, her mind turning over the new fragment like a jeweler examining a flawed stone. At Dane Mead Cottage she found Inspector Craddock waiting, hat in hand, a sheaf of papers under his arm. "Morning, Miss Marple. Thought you'd like to know Vargas singing like a canary. Claims the medal was promised him by a dying comrade in a Viennese hospital. Says Mrs. Hargrove's husband stole it in 1918. Of course, he's got papers forged, naturally. We found the dies in his lodgings." Miss Marple poured tea. "And the money?" 2,000 in notes, wrapped in a silk stocking at the bottom of the attach case. Plus a pearl necklace Mrs. Hargrove swears she lost at the bridge club last year. Craddock accepted a biscuit. He admits the gun was loaded. Says he only meant to frighten her. Miss Marple's needles clicked. He frightened her into burning letters, into locking her door, into walking to Milchester in the dark. Fear is a powerful weapon, Inspector. Craddock nodded. We're holding him on extortion and possession of a firearm. The forgery charges will follow. Mrs. Hargrove refuses to press charges for the theft, says the medal was rightfully his relation's. Sentimental, if you ask me. Sentiment, said Miss Marple, is often the last refuge of the defrauded. The inspector departed, promising a full report. Miss Marple spent the afternoon in her garden, pruning the lavender and noting with satisfaction that the frost had spared the rosemary. At 4 o'clock, Gladys arrived, apron starched, eyes bright with importance. Madam's ever so much better, miss? Slept the clock round. Says to thank you for the jelly, and to say the curtains will be open from now on. She hesitated. There's something else. In the lining of the attached caselet, open with a razor. A photograph. Miss Marple took the small snapshot. It showed 2 young officers in the trenches, arms about each other's shoulders. On the back, in faded ink, to Janos, with affection R.H. Passchendaele, 1917. The faces were unmistakable. Captain Hargrove and a dark-haired man with a mustache. Not unlike Vargas. Gladys watched her anxiously. Madam says it proves everything. Says the medal was never hers to keep. Miss Marple returned the photograph. Tell Mrs. Hargrove that memory is a private matter. The law concerns itself with facts. That evening the village hall was packed for the inquest. Mrs. Hargrove gave evidence in a voice that trembled only once. Varga, in the dock, stared at the floor. Major Palgrave repeated his story with embellishments. Dr. Haydock confirmed the state of Mrs. Hargrove's nerves. Inspector Craddock laid the forged documents on the table like a hand of cards. The coroner returned a verdict of attempted extortion. Varga was remanded in custody. Afterwards, in the cold starlight, Miss Marple walked home with the Major. Neatly done, he said, though I still say the fellow should swing. None of this namby-pamby prison nonsense, Miss Marple smiled. Justice, Major, is like gardening. One must prune carefully, or the whole bed is spoiled. At Dame Mead Cottage she lit the lamps and drew the curtains not early, but at the proper time. Across the lane, Laburnum Cottage glowed with light, every window open to the night. The empty frame above the mantel had been removed. In its place hung a watercolor of the Alps, a wedding present from Captain Hargrove's honeymoon. Miss Marple took up her knitting. The pattern was nearly finished, a scarf in soft blue wool, a Christmas gift for her nephew. She worked steadily, the needles flashing in the firelight. Outside, the frost returned, crisp and clean. Willowbrook slept, unaware that the medal which had caused such turmoil was, at that moment, locked in a police safe, waiting to be returned to the War Office as unclaimed property. Some stories, Miss Marple reflected, ended not with a flourish, but with a quiet restoration of order. The curtains were open. The village was at peace. And in the morning, the post would bring fresh seeds for next year's garden. Chapter 5. The Vanishing Visitor. The peace that settled over Willowbrook after the inquest was of the brittle sort that follows a thunderstorm. The air clear, the ground sodden, every leaf still trembling. Mrs. Hargrove kept to Laburnum Cottage, receiving no callers except the vicar's wife with a basket of calves' foot jelly and Miss Marple with a small pot of damson preserve. The village, deprived of fresh sensation, turned its attention to the forthcoming Christmas bazaar and the question of whether Mrs. Price's lumbago would permit her to man the bran tub. Miss Marple, for her part, resumed the gentle rhythm of her days. She rose at 7, breakfasted at 8, gardened until the light failed, and knitted in the evenings by the fire. Yet she was not idle. Each morning she walked to the post office at precisely 9:20, timing her arrival to coincide with the sorting of the London mail. Each afternoon she pruned a different rose bush, positioning herself so that the side gate of Laburnum Cottage lay within her line of sight. And each evening at 6:30 she drew her own curtains and noted whether the corresponding ritual had been performed across the lane. On the 7th day after the inquest, the pattern altered. At 4:45 earlier than the deepening dusk required, the green velvet curtains of Mrs. Hargrove's drawing room were pulled tight. 10 minutes later, the upstairs bedroom followed suit. Miss Marple, shelling peas in her kitchen, heard the click of the gate and the crunch of hurried footsteps. Gladys, bonnet askew, appeared at the back door. "Miss, it's Madam. She's took worse again. Won't eat, won't speak. Just sits by the fire staring at nothing. And there's a telegram come this morning." She read it and went white as chalk. Miss Marple wiped her hands on a towel. "Show me." The telegram was brief. The paper creased from much handling. "Arriving tonight, stop imperative, we meet stop, do not fail stop KV." The message was unsigned, but the initials were unmistakable. Miss Marple turned the flimsy sheet over. On the reverse, in Mrs. Hargrove's shaking hand, was scrawled, "He is not in prison." "God help me." Gladys twisted her apron. "I thought he was locked up safe." "So did we all," said Miss Marple quietly. "Telephone Inspector Craddock, child. Tell him to come at once and to bring Sergeant Pauk." While Gladys ran to the instrument, Miss Marple fetched her coat and a small electric torch. The frost had returned with a vengeance. The gravel crackled underfoot like breaking glass. She crossed the lane and rapped sharply at Laburnum Cottage. There was no reply. She tried the door. Locked. The side gate yielded to her touch. The garden lay in darkness. The flower beds rhymed white. A single light burned in the kitchen. Through the window, Miss Marple saw Mrs. Hargrove seated at the table, a suitcase open before her. She was packing with frantic haste. Clothes, papers, the blue attach case. Her face was a mask of terror. Miss Marple tapped on the glass. Mrs. Hargrove started violently, then recognized her visitor and unbolted the door. "Jane, thank heaven. He's coming tonight on the last train. Says if I don't give him the bonds, he'll burn the house with me in it. I've telephoned the bank. They won't release the securities without my signature in person. I thought to take the midnight bus to town." "You will do nothing of the sort," said Miss Marple firmly. "Inspector Craddock is on his way. Lock the doors, draw the curtains, and wait in the drawing room. Gladys and I will keep watch." Mrs. Hargrove clutched her arm. "You don't understand. He has a key, my husband's old key. He showed me. And a revolver. He'll kill us all." Miss Marple's voice was steady. "Then we must ensure he does not enter alone." She dispatched Gladys to admit the police by the front, stationed herself at the kitchen window, and waited. The church clock struck 6, 7:30. The village settled into its winter torpor. At 20 minutes to 8, headlights swept the lane. Inspector Craddock's Wolseley, followed by the police van. The men deployed with quiet efficiency, 2 at the front, 2 at the back, Craddock and Pauk with Mrs. Hargrove in the drawing room. Miss Marple remained in the kitchen, torch in hand. At 5 minutes to 8, she heard the soft scrape of a key in the lock. The door opened a cautious inch. A gloved hand appeared, then a shoulder. The man was tall, muffled in a dark overcoat, a scarf across the lower part of his face. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Miss Marple switched on her torch. The beam caught Carol Varga full in the face pale, unshaven, the eyes wild. "Looking for something, Mr. Varga?" she asked pleasantly. He swore in Hungarian and reached for his pocket. Before the revolver cleared the cloth, Sergeant Pauk's bulk filled the doorway. The pistol clattered to the tiles. Varga followed it, winded by a blow to the solar plexus. Handcuffs clicked shut. Craddock appeared, coat unbuttoned, breath steaming. "Neatly done, Miss Marple." He must have slipped the escort at Milchester Asses's changed clothes with a plumber's mate. "We've been searching the county for him." Mrs. Hargrove, supported by Gladys, peered round the door. At the sight of Varga on the floor, she gave a small, broken cry and fainted clean away. Later, When the prisoner had been removed and sal volatile administered, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Hargrove by the replenished fire. The bonds lay safe in Craddock's briefcase. The blue attach case had been returned to the bank. Varga, it transpired, had bribed a warder with money intended for his defense and walked out during the afternoon exercise period. He meant to flee to the continent, Craddock explained. The telegram was sent from a public call box in Milchester. We traced it 20 minutes too late. Mrs. Hargrove's voice was a thread. I thought the nightmare was over. It is now, said Miss Marple. Tomorrow you will go to the bank, sign the necessary papers, and place the bonds in a new account, requiring 2 signatures, yours and the vicar's perhaps. No one will trouble you again. She rose to leave. At the door she paused. The curtains, Eleanor. Leave them open. Darkness breeds fear. Light is the best disinfectant. Outside, the frost glittered under the street lamps. The police vehicles had gone. The lane was empty save for the faint tracks of many boots. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her torch beam cutting a pale path through the night. At Mead cottage she lit the lamps, drew her own curtains, not early, but at the proper time, and took up her knitting. The scarf for Raymond was nearly finished. She worked another row, the needles flashing in the firelight. Somewhere in the county jail, Carrel Varga was learning that escape was temporary, justice less so. In Laburnum Cottage, the curtains remained open, and Mrs. Hargrove slept for the first time in a week without the aid of sedatives. Willowbrook would talk, of course. The story would grow in the telling. The foreign desperado, the brave spinster, the midnight arrest in the kitchen. By Christmas it would be a legend. Miss Marple did not mind. Legends, like gardens, needed pruning now and then, but they served to remind the village that peace was not the absence of danger, but the presence of watchfulness. She finished the row, cast off, and held the scarf to the light. The wool was soft, the color of a summer sky. She folded it neatly, placed it in tissue paper, and set it aside for posting. Then she banked the fire, turned out the lamps, and went upstairs to bed. Outside, the frost deepened, and the open curtains of Laburnum Cottage let in the cold, clear light of the stars. Chapter 6. The second closing. The village awoke to a sky the color of pewter, and the news that Carrel Varga had hanged himself in his cell, with a strip torn from his prison blanket. The Milchester Gazette carried the story on the front page, beneath a photograph of the county jail. Foreign extortionist cheats the gallows. By 9 o'clock, the post office queue was discussing little else. Mrs. Blade, sorting letters with the brisk efficiency of a croupier, declared that foreigners were all alike hot-blooded, unreliable, and best kept at arm's length. The butcher opined that the blanket must have been rotten. The baker countered that despair was a great solvent of hemp. Miss Marple read the paragraph over her morning tea, folded the paper small, and placed it beside her plate. She had expected something of the sort. Men like Varga lived on the edge of a knife. When the blade turned, they cut themselves. She finished her toast, rinsed the cup, and walked across the lane to Laburnum Cottage. Gladys opened the door in her dressing gown, eyes swollen. "She's took it bad, miss. Won't get up. Says it's her fault. He'd be alive if she'd given him the money quiet-like." Miss Marple stepped inside. The house smelled of camphor and grief. The drawing-room fire was out. The green curtains were drawn tight, though the day was barely begun. She found Mrs. Hargrove in the bedroom, propped against pillows, a tray of untouched breakfast beside her. "Eleanor," Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm, "you will drink this tea, and then you will dress. The inquest is at 11, and you must be there." Mrs. Hargrove's lips trembled. "I killed him, Jane. My stubbornness." "You killed no one. A man who chooses suicide chooses his own path. You offered him justice. He preferred oblivion." She poured tea, added milk, pressed the cup into unwilling hands. "Drink." Mrs. Hargrove drank. Color returned faintly to her cheeks. Miss Marple opened the curtains. Pale light flooded the room, revealing the clutter of illness. Medicine bottles, a hot water bottle gone cold, a crumpled telegram on the floor. The second closing of the curtains, Miss Marple said, was not yours, but his. He wished the village to think you were alone, despairing, ready to be frightened into compliance. Instead, he found the house watched, the net drawn. His death is the final act of a coward. She helped Mrs. Hargrove to dress gray skirt, white blouse, the cameo brooch that had been her mother's. By 10 o'clock, they were ready. Inspector Craddock called with the Wolseley. Sergeant Pauk held the door. The drive to Milchester was silent save for the swish of tires on wet leaves. The inquest was held in the Corn Exchange, hastily converted with trestle tables and a Union Jack. The coroner, a thin man with a voice like a rusty hinge, read the medical evidence. Death by strangulation, no signs of external violence. The prison governor testified that Varga had seemed resigned, even cheerful, during the afternoon. The warder who discovered the body was shaken but coherent. Mrs. Hargrove, pale but composed, confirmed the history of the extortion. When asked if she had any reason to believe the prisoner contemplated suicide, she replied, "He feared disgrace more than death." "I see that now." The jury returned a verdict of suicide, while of unsound mind in 7 minutes. Outside, the rain had begun, a thin, persistent drizzle that turned the cobbles to mirrors. Craddock offered Mrs. Hargrove his umbrella. She declined with a small shake of the head. "I must walk alone a little," she said. "Thank you, Inspector." "Thank you, Jane." She set off down the high street, a solitary figure in black. Miss Marple watched until she turned the corner by the War Memorial, then accepted Craddock's offer of a lift home. In the car, the inspector lit a cigarette. "Clean enough, I suppose, though I'd have liked to see him swing." "Death is death," said Miss Marple. "The manner is less important than the motive." Craddock glanced at her. "You think he meant to die all along?" "I think he meant to escape consequence. When escape failed, he chose the only door left." They reached Willowbrook as dusk gathered. The rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. The Burnham cottage was dark, the curtains drawn once more. Miss Marple's heart misgave her. "Stop here, please." She ran up the path and rang the bell. No answer. The side gate was unlatched. In the kitchen, the gas was lit but low. A note lay on the table weighted by the sugar basin. "Forgive me. I cannot bear the whispers. By the time you read this, I shall be with Richard. E.H. beside the note. An empty pill bottle, a glass smelling of brandy, a single white tablet dissolved in the dregs." Miss Marple acted with the precision of long practice. She telephoned Dr. Haydock, then Craddock, then the ambulance. While she waited, she searched the house. Mrs. Hargrove lay fully dressed on the bedroom floor, breathing stertorously, pupils pinpoints. The pill bottle had contained 20 veronal tablets. 18 were gone. Haydock arrived within minutes, syringe in hand. Stomach pump and saline. "We may be in time." They worked over her for an hour. Pump, emetic strong coffee forced between clenched teeth. At length the breathing steadied. The pulse strengthened. Mrs. Hargrove opened her eyes, looked at Miss Marple without recognition, and slept. In the kitchen Craddock examined the note. Same hand as the telegram. "But look, the slope is wrong. Left-handed, not right." Miss Marple took the paper. The writing was indeed reversed, the pressure heavy on the downstrokes. Someone forged this. Someone who knew her habits, her medicines, her despair. Gladys, summoned from her sisters, arrived white-faced. "I left at 6, miss. Madam said she wanted thee alone. The bottle was full yesterday. Doctor refilled it after the first scare." Craddock's jaw set. "Then we're dealing with murder, not suicide. And the murderer is still at large." He posted a constable at the door and telephoned the yard. Miss Marple sat by the bedroom fire, her knitting untouched in her lap. Outside, The rain began again, drumming on the panes like impatient fingers. The curtains remained closed, but now they hid a vigil, not a secret. At midnight, Mrs. Hargrove woke fully. Her voice was a thread. He came back. Not Vargas, someone else. Sadhi was Vargas' partner. Said if I didn't pay again, the police would find letters proving Richard was a thief, a deserter. He forced the pills on me, held my nose, poured them down. I fought, but he was too strong. Miss Marple took her hand. Describe him. Tall, fair hair, spoke good English, but not quite. A scar on the left cheek, thin, white. Craddock, listening from the doorway, swore softly. Janos Varga Carroll's cousin. We had a tip he was in Southampton. Thought he'd sailed. Mrs. Hargrove's eyes closed. He took the pearl necklace from the safe, and the letter Richard wrote to Janos, the real one, not the forgery. Said it would buy silence in Vienna. Miss Marple's mind raced. The necklace had been returned after the first arrest. The letter was the photograph's twin, the final proof of legitimacy. With both, Janos could bleed the estate dry through continental lawyers. She rose. Inspector, the midnight bus to Southampton leaves in 20 minutes. If Janos is on it, we may still stop him. Craddock hesitated only a moment. Talk radio the county cars. Miss Marple, you're with me. They reached the crossroads as the bus lurched into view, headlights cutting the rain. Craddock flagged it down. The driver braked with a hiss. Passengers peered through steamed windows. In the rear seat sat a tall man in a camel hair coat, a scarf to his chin, a suitcase on his knee. Craddock boarded, revolver drawn. Janos Vargas, stay where you are. The man sprang up, suitcase swinging. It struck Craddock's wrist. The revolver clattered. Janos vaulted the seats, made for the emergency exit. Miss Marple, small and implacable, stepped into the aisle and brought her umbrella down smartly across his shins. He stumbled. Pock's arms closed round him like a vice. The necklace spilled from the suitcase in a rope of fire. Beneath it lay a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. Craddock snapped on the handcuffs. Attempted murder, theft, conspiracy. You'll hang for this one, my lad. Janos spat a stream of Hungarian. Miss Marple translated quietly. He says the English are fools and the Hargroves thieves. He is wrong on both counts. Back at Laburnum Cottage, dawn was breaking as the ambulance took Mrs. Hargrove to hospital for observation. The curtains were opened wide. The morning light revealed the disorder of the night-overturned chair, scattered pills, the brandy glass shattered on the hearth. Gladys wept with relief as she swept the fragments. Miss Marple stood at the window, watching the village stir to life. The rain had ceased. A weak sun glinted on the wet roofs. Somewhere a cock crowed, defiant and absurd. Craddock joined her. She lived. And with Janos in the dock, the Vienna lawyers will drop the claim like a hot coal. Miss Marple nodded. The second closing of the curtains was meant to hide a murder. Instead, revealed one. Human nature, Inspector, is a tapestry of light and shadow. Pull the right thread, and the pattern becomes clear. She returned home as the church clock struck 6. Dane Mead cottage was cold. She lit the fire, put the kettle on, and took up her knitting. The blue scarf was finished, the ends neatly fringed. She wrapped it in tissue, addressed the parcel to Raymond, and set it by the door for the post. Outside, the curtains of Laburnum Cottage remained open, letting in the pale November sun. The village would talk for weeks of poison, pearls, and the quiet spinster who had twice saved a widow's life. Miss Marple did not mind. Talk was the village's way of digesting wonder, and wonder, like bread, was best shared. She poured tea, added lemon, and sat by the fire. The needles lay idle in her lap. For the first time in 10 days, Willowbrook was at peace. Chapter 7. The Truth in the Pattern. The hospital released Mrs. Hargrove on the 3rd day with a bottle of tonic and a caution against excitement. She returned to Laburnum Cottage in a hired car, pale but upright, and insisted on walking the last 50 yards unaided. The village watched from behind net curtains. The post office sold out of stamps by noon. Gladys, reinstated with a rise in wages, had aired the beds, beaten the rugs, and baked a Madeira cake in honor of the occasion. The green velvet curtains were taken down, washed, and rehung so that they fell in perfect folds. Light, clean, honest, winter light poured into every room. Miss Marple called at 4 o'clock with a jar of beef tea and a small posy of forced violets. She found Mrs. Hargrove in the drawing room, the fire blazing, the pearl necklace restored to its velvet case on the mantel. The empty brass frame had been replaced by a watercolor of the Downs. The safe stood open and empty, its contents transferred to the bank. "Jane," Mrs. Hargrove's voice was steadier than it had been in weeks. "I owe you my life twice over. How can I ever—" "You can begin," said Miss Marple briskly, "by drinking this tea and eating a slice of Gladys's cake. Grief is best taken with sugar." They sat in companionable silence while the kettle sang in the kitchen. Outside, the frost had returned, turning the lane to a ribbon of silver. A black saloon, this one, with a police driver, drew up at the gate. Inspector Craddock alighted, hat in hand, and was admitted by Gladys with a curtsy that nearly toppled the tea tray. "Afternoon, laddies. Thought you'd like the latest." He laid a folder on the table. Janos Vargas confessed everything. The metal scam was Carell's idea, forged letters, photographs touched up in a Soho studio. Janos handled the rough stuff. They'd worked the same game on 3 other widows in Austria before lighting on Mrs. Hargrove. The necklace was to be the final payment. The forged suicide note was meant to close the book. Mrs. Hargrove's hands trembled on her cup. And the real letter, Richard's letter to Janos? Burned by Carell the night he first came. Janos kept the copy insurance, he called it. "We found the ashes in the Milchester lodging house grate." Craddock's tone softened. "Your husband was no thief, ma'am. The medal was awarded fair and square. The War Office has confirmed it." Mrs. Hargrove closed her eyes. A single tear slid down the powder on her cheek. Miss Marple handed her a handkerchief without comment. When Craddock had gone, promising to return the necklace officially once the case was closed, Mrs. Hargrove turned to her friend. "I was a fool, Jane. I let sentiment blind me to greed. If not for you, if not for curtains," Miss Marple corrected gently. "The first early closing hid a visitor. The second hid a murder. Between them lay the truth." She rose to leave, but Mrs. Hargrove detained her. "Stay to supper. Gladys has a chicken. We will open a bottle of the captain's claret. There are still 6 in the cellar. Let us drink to clarity." Miss Marple accepted. The meal was simple but excellent. Clear soup, roast chicken with sage stuffing, apple charlotte. The claret was mellow, the conversation subdued. Afterwards, they sat by the fire while Gladys washed up. Mrs. Hargrove produced a small morocco case from the drawer. "The bank returned this with the bonds. I want you to have it." She opened the lid. Inside lay a brooch, a circle of seed pearls surrounding a tiny enamel. "Forget-me-not." It was my mother's. She wore it when she wished to remember that kindness is stronger than fear. Miss Marple pinned the brooch to her blouse. "I shall wear it when I prune the roses. They, too, need reminding." She walked home under a sky pricked with stars. Mead Cottage was warm. The fire had been banked by Mrs. Murgatroyd. Miss Marple lit the lamps, drew the curtains not early, but at the proper time, and took up her knitting. The blue scarf was posted. She began a pair of bed socks in lilac wool, a gift for the vicar's wife. At 10 o'clock, the telephone rang. Inspector Craddock's voice was jubilant. "Thought you'd like to know Janos has named the Soho forger. We've got the whole gang. And the medal's on its way back to the War Office. Mrs. Hargrove will get a letter of commendation from the chief constable." Miss Marple thanked him and hung up. She stood for a moment in the hall, one hand on the banister. The house was quiet, the village quieter still. Somewhere across the lane, Mrs. Hargrove was learning to live with open curtains and an open heart. She returned to the sitting room, added coal to the fire, and resumed her knitting. The pattern was simple rib and garter stitch, but the wool was soft, the color soothing. Outside, the frost deepened. The stars burned cold and clear. Willowbrook slept, its secrets laid bare, its widows safe. Miss Marple worked until the church clock struck 11, and cast off the first sock and held it to the light. Perfect. She folded it neatly, placed it in the work-basket, and went upstairs to bed. The forget-me-not brooch gleamed on the dressing-table, catching the moonlight like a small, steady eye. In the morning, there would be letters to write, roses to prune, the ordinary commerce of a village winter. But tonight, there was only the tick of the clock, the scent of lavender polish, and the knowledge that a pattern, once tangled, had been smoothed into clarity. She slept without dreaming. Chapter 8. The Quiet Arrest. The trial of Janos Varga and his confederates took place in the bleak January assizes at Milchester, a proceeding as brisk and unemotional as the weather outside the courthouse. The forger from Soho, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a perpetual cough, turned King's evidence and detailed the mechanics of the fraud with the enthusiasm of a mechanic describing a faulty carburetor. Janos, heavier now from prison fare, stood in the dock with the stolidity of a man who has already calculated the length of his rope. The jury was out for 43 minutes. Guilty on all counts. The judge, adjusting his spectacles, sentenced Janos to 15 years penal servitude and the forger to 7. The Soho studio was raided. The dyes, the green ink, the violet-scented notepaper were laid before the court like the disjecta membra of a failed conspiracy. Willowbrook received the news with the satisfied nod of village that has seen justice done without inconvenience to itself. The Milchester Gazette printed a dignified paragraph. Mrs. Blade sold extra copies to trippers from the London train. Major Palgrave was heard to declare that the whole business proved his point about foreigners. Life resumed its gentle rhythm. The Christmas bazaar raised £43 for the organ fund. Mrs. Price's lumbago responded to a liniment of goose grease and turpentine, and the frost gave way to a mild spell that brought the snowdrops into early bud. Mrs. Hargrove, fortified by beef tea and the knowledge that her husband's honor was intact, reopened Laburnum Cottage to callers. She joined the Women's Institute sewing circle, took her turn at the church flowers, and presented the vicar with a new hassock worked in crimson velvet. The green curtains were replaced by sprigged muslin. The safe was removed entirely, and its alcove filled with a bookcase of improving volumes. The pearl necklace, cleaned and restrung, was worn only on high days and holidays. Miss Marple, serenely knitting, observed the restoration with quiet approval. She attended the first meeting of the sewing circle after the trial, contributed a tray of scones, and listened while Mrs. Hargrove recounted, without dramatics, the events of that November night. The ladies exclaimed, sympathized, and passed the plate. By the time the tea was poured, the adventure had been filed away under the heading Providence, and the conversation turned to the price of wool. On the last day of January, the post brought Miss Marple a small official envelope bearing the crest of the War Office. Inside was the military cross, cleaned and remounted on a fresh ribbon, together with a letter on heavy cream paper. Dear Madam, the Secretary of State for War has directed me to forward the enclosed decoration, lately the subject of litigation, with the request that you accept it in recognition of your services to a brother officer's memory. The medal will be inscribed on the reverse as you direct. Yours faithfully call H.S.T. J. Featherstonehoff. Miss Marple read the letter twice, folded it small, and placed it in the drawer with her best handkerchiefs. She carried the medal across the lane to Laburnum Cottage. Mrs. Hargrove received her in the drawing-room, where the fire burned bright and the muslin curtains stirred in the mild air. The two women sat together on the sofa, the little cross between them on a cushion of black velvet. "It is yours by right," said Miss Marple. "The War Office merely holds it in trust." Mrs. Hargrove touched the ribbon with a reverent finger. "Richard would have wished it to stay in Willowbrook. Let us give it to the church beneath the memorial window. A plaque, in memory of Captain Richard Hargrove, Men.C., and of the kindness that preserved his name." Miss Marple inclined her head. "A fitting resting place." The presentation was made on the following Sunday after Matins. A vicar, unprepared for such a gift, preached an extempore sermon on the text, "Greater love hath no man." The medal, in a glass case lined with crimson, was placed on a bracket beneath the east window, where the light caught the silver and turned it to fire. Mrs. Hargrove, in dove-gray silk, stood beside Miss Marple in navy blue, the forget-me-not brooch gleaming at her throat. The congregation sang "O God, our help in ages past," with more gusto than tune, and the collection plates were heavy with sixpences. Afterwards, in the vestry, the vicar pressed Miss Marple's hand. "A memorable day, dear lady. Willowbrook will not forget." Miss Marple smiled. "Villages remember what they choose, vicar. Let us hope they choose wisely." She walked home through the churchyard, pausing to note that the snowdrops were indeed in mud. At Dane Mead cottage the fire was laid. Mrs. Murgatroyd had left a carrot loaf and a note about the chimney sweep. Miss Marple lit the fire, cut a slice of loaf, and carried her tea to the window. Across the lane, the Burnham cottage glowed with lamplight. The muslin curtains moved gently in the breeze from the open casement. Somewhere inside, Mrs. Hargrove was doubtless writing letters or planning the spring planting. The curtains would never close early again. Miss Marple drew her own curtains at the proper time, lit the lamps, and took up her knitting. The lilac bedsocks were finished. She began a pair in soft gray for Dr. Haydock, who complained of cold feet on his rounds. The needles clicked steadily, the fire settled with a comfortable sigh. Outside, the mild air carried the faint scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. At 9 o'clock, Inspector Craddock telephoned from Milchester. "Thought you'd like the epilogue, Miss Marple." Janos tried to escape again over the wall with a rope of knotted sheets. Landed in the infirmary with a broken ankle. The forger's turned missionary. He's teaching the other prisoners to read. And the violet notepaper has been traced to a stationer in Proglows Down by the Communists. The trail ends there. Miss Marple thanked him and hung up. She stood for a moment in the hall, listening to the tick of the clock. Then she returned to the sitting room, added a scoop of coal, and resumed her knitting. The pattern was simple, the wool warm between her fingers. In the church, the military cross caught the moonlight and threw it back in a small, steady gleam. In the Burnham cottage, the lamps burned late, and the curtains stayed open to the night. Willowbrook slept, its secrets buried, its widows safe, its spinster knitting by the fire. Some threads, Miss Marple reflected, were meant to be cut clean. Others were woven into the fabric of the village, strong and invisible, holding the pattern true. She worked another row, cast off, and held the sock to the light. Perfect. She folded it neatly, placed it in the work-basket, and went upstairs to bed. The forget-me-not brooch lay on the dressing-table, the enamel flower bright against the dark wood. Outside, the mild January night wrapped the village in quiet. The curtains of Dane Mead cottage were drawn, but the windows of the soul, as Miss Marple sometimes thought, remained always open, watching, waiting, ready for the next small deviation from the accustomed pattern. In Willowbrook, as in human nature, peace was not the absence of incident, but the presence of vigilance. And vigilance, like knitting, required only patience, good wool, and a steady hand.